We have been blessed with hundreds of awesome summons over the years. After their introduction, they have elevated the fantastical essence of the series by providing the perfect synergy between mythology and gameplay. Their elaborate and captivating summoning sequences have also enhanced the visual spectacles of their respective games, but the greatest impact of summons, in general at least, has to be their combat application. Now, many summons have possessed either incredible damage outputs or strong utility, but there is a notable array of summons that fell significantly short by comparison. Contrary to their intended purpose, summons of this caliber seldom proved advantageous to the player, and in certain scenarios could even pose significant hindrances to the party. As such, these underwhelming attributes often made them obsolete, doomed to being used for their non-combat utility, or even not at all. It's these curious summons that we're going to be focusing on throughout this video, so with the usual caveat that we'll only be talking about one summon per game, strap yourselves in as we take a look at 7 summons that ended up being almost completely useless. And we're going to kick things off with a Goblin from Final Fantasy IV. Across a number of Final Fantasy games, while many summons can be acquired via story progression, some can only, instead, be obtainable through optional routes. In Final Fantasy IV, units like Odin and Bahamut were locked behind side content that required some extra effort to complete on the player's end. For entities of this kind, the payoff was quite significant given their substantial aid on the battlefield. But regrettably, not every optional summon fell into this category, as some offered next to nothing in terms of combat prowess, and Final Fantasy IV featured not one, but 4 summons that fell into this category. Now, we're going to focus on the Goblin, but the same sentiment could be applied to the Mind Flayer, the Bomb, and the Cockatrice, as they are all rare drop monster summons. In the case of the Goblin though, it was essentially a mirror of its enemy counterpart in both appearance and ability. As such, its combat potential was rather poor, as it possessed a spell power of just 8 in the 2D version of Final Fantasy IV. This meant that for a cost of 1 MP, players could summon the Goblin to deal very underwhelming non-elemental damage with its Goblin Punch ability. Considering Goblins and Goblin variants often made up the game's weaker enemy encounters, the summon's lackadaisical performance shouldn't have been all that surprising. But what made it quite surprising was that the sheer difficulty of acquiring the Goblin summon made its uselessness even more disappointing. In order to get the Goblin summon for Rydia, players would have to obtain the Goblin drop item from either a Goblin or its variant, the Little Murderer. It sounded simple enough, but the drop rate was 0.39%. As such, players could find themselves having to undertake a lengthy series of battles just to get the Goblin, and the reward definitely was not worth it. In the majority of Final Fantasy games, acquiring anything labelled as Ultimate has to be seen as a substantial and grand achievement, whether it's ultimate weapons, spells, or limit breaks. They almost always offer a marked improvement in damage dealing capabilities and general utility. Almost is the optimum word here though, as even though Crusader did deal a lot of damage after being acquired in Final Fantasy VI as the ultimate summon, there was also a pretty extreme caveat. To obtain Crusaders, players were required to defeat all 8 legendary dragons, and in this regard, this was a befitting quest to obtain the game's ultimate summon. It cost a whopping 96 MP to call forth, and when done so, Crusader would perform the Cleansing or Purifier ability, which dealt huge amounts of damage. This should have been quite valuable, but Crusader also targeted the player party as well. This meant its application was very similar to Meltdown, an ability it also taught. So unless the player employed re-raise or possessed a character with extremely high magic defense, summoning Crusader would likely result in an instant game over. Crusader did have other utility though, as it could teach Meteor and Meltdown as mentioned. It also offered a level up bonus of plus 50% MP to the assigned party member. But by the time the player could actually obtain Crusader, many of these bonuses were moot, and they were likely to possess other abilities and resources that were far more efficient in combat, that didn't have the same horrible caveat. The next entry on our list serves as a direct homage to another Square title, Hanjaku Hero, and it's become quite notorious. Yes, we're going to talk about the practical application of Eggman from Final Fantasy V. The requirements for even gaining access to Eggman were quite strict and bizarre. Instead of being a conventional summon, Eggman was only accessible via the magic lamp item, and even then, it would only appear under specific conditions. The magic lamp operated via a countdown mechanic. Starting with the most powerful summon, Bahamut, each use of the magic lamp would see the summoned creature decrease in strength, and after 13 uses, it would reach its soft limit and only summon the Chocobo, the supposed weakest summon in the game. Unless the player then recharged the lamp, it would continue to summon Chocobo upon use. But interestingly, if the player were to use it many more times, Eggman would appear. But instead of being some amazing hidden summon that eradicated all opposing foes, it did absolutely nothing. Perhaps due to it being a gag reference, when summoned, Eggman wouldn't even be visible on the screen. And while text boxes did note its attempt to use its Egg Chop ability, the move did nothing, with the player informed that its uselessness was due to the enemy being too far away, meaning Eggman simply couldn't reach its target. In Final Fantasy VIII, the role of summons expanded to become a core element of not just the game's combat system, but also character development and the wider application of the junction system. The game's broad selection of summons, now known as Guardian Forces, also became a bit more nuanced, featuring entities that hadn't traditionally appeared as summons before. Some of these included Quetzalcoatl, Doomtrain, and Pandemona. But Final Fantasy VIII was also notable for having the Tombur appear as a summon for the first time in the series. Unfortunately, its summoning debut was hampered by its lackluster utility that ended up being quite different from the other Guardian Forces. In order to recruit the Tombur, players had to kill around 20 regular random encounter Tomburs and then defeat the Tombur King in battle. Once acquired though, it was much less threatening than its boss form, as it wouldn't possess any stack junctions to enhance the assigned characters. Tombur would still have a number of unique abilities, but most would have some sort of drawback or more efficient alternative. For example, while it had rarer evasion and luck enhancing abilities, the increase wouldn't be by much. Additionally, its move HP up and auto potion abilities, while useful, weren't as efficient as some other alternatives. Tombur did have some handy abilities relating to the shop though, such as its Cool Shop, Sell High, Haggle and Familiar abilities, but they also required a lot of AP. So while Tombur did have some decent uses, it was much less useful and threatening than its other Guardian Force counterparts. Earlier, we discussed the destructive force of Crusader from Final Fantasy VI, noting the obvious hindrances it could inflict upon the party if they were not suitably prepared. But Crusader is not alone in its ability to inconvenience players to a substantial degree. And that brings us onto Carbuncle from Final Fantasy Tactics. Due to the dynamic nature of Tactics, where battles played out on an isometric battlefield, the function of summons was required to change. Most of them had this change play out by their abilities affecting an area of the battlefield as opposed to all enemies. But the application of Carbuncle largely stayed the same. When called upon, Carbuncle would cast Reflect. And as the general application stayed the same, this meant it affected the entire party as opposed to a small selection of units within a specific area. As with most Reflect magic, this had incredible utility in terms of its capability for preventing incoming magic damage, with the caveat that it would also prevent incoming restorative spells and other enhancements. This was par for the course in terms of the perils of using Reflect, but what elevated the Tactics version of Carbuncle was how Reflect worked in that particular game. Because of the isometric battlefield, Reflect was not guaranteed to reflect back to the opposing line. Instead, reflected spells could bounce off in any direction, affecting units at random. This meant reflected spells could still end up hurting party members because double reflecting was not prohibited, and this meant its general utility was therefore rather moot. Final Fantasy IX placed summons, here known as Eidolons, in the spotlight. They were an important part of the game's lore, and as a result, were at the centre of some of the most awe-striking scenarios and FMVs as the game progressed. From Odin destroying Clara to Princess Garnet and Ico summoning Alexander, these instances generated a magnifying aura for the Eidolons, making them appear that much more fearsome. But while many of these intricate FMVs painted a stunning picture, teasing the power that players would later gain access to, some of them, unfortunately, led more towards false advertising. And the real standout here has to be Atmos. During Alexandria's assault of Limblum, the way Atmos was deployed was rather harrowing. Using incredible force, it sucked people, animals, and even buildings into its huge mouth, leaving the venerable city ravaged. Players were then curious as to how this would translate into battlefield application, and they ended up being a little bit underwhelmed. Just as in Final Fantasy V, Atmos, who could be acquired from Dr. Tot via normal story progression, was aligned with the gravity element. This meant its signature ability, G-Force 199, like all gravity skills, would inflict fractional damage, but it could be increased by the number of amethysts on hand. On paper, this meant Atmos could be Garnet's most powerful Eidolon, as it had the potential to deal 9,999 damage with a high degree of reliability. But the caveat was that this only worked if the target was not immune to gravity. It meant that Atmos did have specific uses, such as farming particular enemies, but for the most part, Atmos would be seldom used compared to the game's other summons due to its situational nature. That then brings us onto our final entry, which is perhaps the most intriguing. When Dissidia Final Fantasy arrived on the PlayStation Portable, it was revolutionary in terms of the Final Fantasy franchise. Before this, even though various cameos and allusions had been made, no canonical property had existed that tied each of the individual games together. In light of Dissidia's status as a two-player fighting game, there were numerous mechanics at play here, and alongside each playable character's extensive moveset, summons were there to add an element of chaos to the battlefield. The roster of summons available to the party was pretty incredible, but while most of them harboured abilities that could add some sort of engaging flair to combat, one entity stood out for having perhaps what could be seen as more of a comical effect than an actual combat skill, and this will be none other than Ultros. Ultros retained its design from Final Fantasy VI, as well as perhaps its role as a character largely rooted in farce. When summoned, Ultros would execute its signature ability, Octopus Ink. In the traditional sense, this would inflict the blind status, and to translate this over to Dissidia, it meant that Octopus Ink obscured the bravery values within the UI. And that was it really. To add insult to injury, Octopus Ink didn't even cover the entire space depicting the bravery values, as they were still slightly visible, thus rendering the ability not all that effective at what it was supposed to do. And with so many other summons possessing far more reliable and effective skills to aid in combat, it meant that compared to them, Ultros ended up being almost completely useless. And with that, they were 7 summons that ended up being nowhere near as effective as many of their peers. Be sure to let us know in the comments below if there were any that you still found practical uses for nonetheless, or if you feel there were any other summons that we should have included instead. And of course, if you enjoyed the video, please be sure to hit the like button and subscribe to the channel. Alright everyone, with that, this is Daryl signing out. As always, I'd like to give a big thank you to all of our Patreon and YouTube membership supporters, especially Benjamin Snow, The Livestream, Gregory, Justin Dent and Sukun TDK, who are super special Onion Eye supporters. And of course, a big thank you to everyone for watching this video. I'll see you all again soon for more Final Fantasy goodness.